Joining us right now, Adrienne Elrod, Democratic strategist and former Hillary for America senior advisor, along with Marc Lotter, former special assistant to President Trump, former press secretary to Vice President Pence. Good to see you this morning, both of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Marc, your reaction to the president's statement yesterday?
I think it was entirely appropriate. It's good that he was able to clarify that so we can get back to talking about the important things, which is where are we going with Russia? What is Russia going to do to help us when it comes to North Korea, when it comes to dealing with the situation in Iran and Syria and energy security in Western Europe? These are the important things we should be talking about.
Yeah, and Adrienne, I guess once again, the Democrats had their hair on fire over something that the president said, and now they've gone too far. They went too far with ICE. They want to abolish ICE. Now they went too far with the president's comments, calling it the Holocaust, Pearl Harbor. Did the Democrats go too far in your view?
Look, I can, speaking as a Democrat, I will say this. And by the way, speaking as an American citizen who's concerned about a foreign adversarial government impacting our elections, I will say this. I think Donald Trump should have stood on that stage next to Vladimir Putin in front of the international community and denounced what Russia has done in terms of meddling in our election. I don't think his correction yesterday, if you want to call it that, was credible. I don't think it was sincere. I think he realized and backtracked when he realized all of the criticism he was getting. And if he actually did misspeak, as he says he did, then he needs to go out there. He needs to make sure that he invests in as much as we can in our government to make sure that these types of things in terms of a foreign adversarial government impacting our elections, meddling in our elections never happens again.
Adrienne, I'll say one thing. The walk is more important than the talk. He corrected what he said on that stage. And here is what this administration is doing with Russia. Defense spending is up. We're taking a harder line than the Obama administration did on Russia. We're talking about sanctions on actual individuals, cronies of Vladimir Putin, large multinational corporations. President Trump didn't say anything about recognizing the annexation of Crimea. He didn't suspend NATO and U.S. activities in the Baltics. He didn't say that we will take troops out of Syria. We need to recognize that and expect. We talked about this on the program yesterday. Ian Bremmer hit all of these issues.
Yes, he did.
Expect tougher sanctions out of this Congress probably by the end of the year because of the interference by Russia in critical U.S. infrastructure.
That's absolutely right. Adrienne, why was President Obama so soft on Russia?
Well, I don't think Obama was soft on Russia at all. He was very critical.
He knew about the meddling, and he did nothing about it.
No, he did plenty about it.
What did he do?
Absolutely did a lot about it. First of all, he issued a statement about a month before the election denouncing it. Secondly, he tried to get Mitch McConnell to sign the statement, and Mitch McConnell was hesitant. So do I think Obama could have done more? Of course I do. And it's something that I think about all the time. But he did a lot. He, frankly, has done a lot more than President Trump.
No, actually, that's not true. The sanctions are a lot more than what President Obama did. That's a fact. Marc Lotter, are you expecting a second round of sanctions by the end of the year, as Dagan suggested?
I think there is likely to be additional sanctions, and for multiple reasons, not just election meddling, but what we're continuing to see going on in other parts of the world and Russia's involvement with it. But as the president said, we're building a strong relationship. That's the important part, because we have to talk. We have to move together to find areas where we agree. And one point I do want to point out is that this administration has already spent $380 million sending it to the states to help protect our election integrity as we approach 2018 and 2020.
Well, the president tweeted on this morning, by the way. He tweeted about the fallout from the Helsinki summit. He says, well, the NATO meeting in Brussels was an acknowledged triumph, with billions of dollars more being put up by member countries at a faster pace. The meeting with Russia may prove to be, in the long run, an even greater success. Many positive things will come out of that meeting. He goes on to say Russia has agreed to help with North Korea, where relationships with the U.S. are very good, and the process is moving along. There is no rush. The sanctions remain. Big benefits and exciting future for North Korea at the end of the process. So what should we expect with North Korea, Marc?
Well, we need the entire world community to join in making sure that we keep the pressure on North Korea, that we make sure that we shut down their access to capital and to products and exports and imports of key minerals, which China, Russia, and many of the other countries are joining with us. As soon as there are breaks in that dam, then we'll see the pressure ease off of North Korea. So having the Russians with us is good, and we just need them to continue to work together on the agreement they've made and getting to a denuclearization plan in place so we can move together with it.
Adrienne, Rahm Emanuel once said we should never let a good crisis go to waste, right? There have been so many crises in the last 2 weeks, whether you think about what happened with how the president spoke at NATO, whether you speak about the press conference in Helsinki, and yet we've had this high level of hysteria on the left that almost cancels out what could be something that they could benefit from. If you were advising the Democrats right now, what do you think they should do in order to change the tide right now or change the conversation?
Well, a couple things. Number one, I wouldn't exactly call concern about President Trump's deteriorating relationships with some of our top allies some sort of hysteria. Look, Democrats don't have any power. We have no control of the House. We have no control of the Senate. We certainly don't control the White House. So speaking out and coming together and pushing back on President Trump is about the only power that we have here. Secondly, again, going back to being a concerned American citizen, I do have a lot of issues with the fact that Donald Trump will stand next to Vladimir Putin, one of the most ruthless dictators in the world, and say that essentially he believes him over our own intelligence. If he actually wants to course correct, as you said earlier, we should walk the walk. He should walk the walk, not just talk the talk, and actually make real change. But again, I don't think Democrats are causing mass hysteria here. I think
Adrienne,
what we're saying,
it's really nice to know.
You compared it to the Holocaust.
Adrienne, it's really nice to know that you clearly are not watching some of these other television networks, because it is wall-to-wall hysterical screeching.
Because
and
people
I'm not
are
talking
very
about
concerned.
just women. I'm talking about men as well. The things that are said on these networks and the kind of manufactured outrage, I am sure that some of these anchors practice their outrage face in the mirror before they go to work in the morning.
Well, but she's right, though, because what she's right about is they have nothing else to do. The economy is going to grow by 4% in the second quarter. Okay, the outcomes of this president have been very positive. They've got hair on fire because they can't deal with the positive outcomes that are coming out of this administration.
We have our hair is on fire, if you will, because we are very concerned about the fact that President Trump seems to want to have more in common and have better relationships with leaders like Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, as opposed to our traditional allies.
What did President Obama say to Medvedev when it had the open mic?
I'll have more flexibility after the election.
Right.
And his pushback on Vladimir Putin after all the interference that the intelligence community and the White House in 2016 already knew about, he looked at him and said, "Cut it out." That's what President Obama said to Vladimir Putin. I think it was in September of 2016.
You also had Hillary Clinton come and hand him the reset button, as the Secretary of State.
No, I'll sit here and
say... Was that
say...
before or after the uranium deal?
I think it was during.
Oh, it was during the...
I just want to add one thing, though. Listen, the last two administrations made mistakes with Russia. They were hoodwinked by Vladimir Putin and the Russia leadership. That's what this administration needs to learn from. Don't let them take advantage of us. They might promise the world on North Korea and Syria, and you can't believe what comes out of their mouth.